Hello. I know. Perhaps no one will believe me. But if you had ever stood in that place, if you had ever breathed that very air, you would understand. You would understand what followed me home from that island. What is whispering in the silence of this room, even after I have done everything to seal it out? They say time heals all wounds. They lied. Time only makes the scars deeper, and some scars are not just on the skin, they are in the mind. They are in the very way you listen to the world. My name is Arthur Finch, and this story is not a warning. It is a curse I'm about to pass on to you. Everything in my life is now divided into two periods, before Echo Isle and after. Now, I live in a box, an apartment designed like a professional recording studio, but not to create sound, but to destroy it. Thick walls, triple-paned windows, an air filtration system that runs constantly, a monotonous hum, a safe substitute for true silence. True silence, it's dangerous. It isn't empty, it is a mouth waiting to devour you. I used to love sound. I was an acoustic architect. I could walk into an old cathedral and tell you why a priest's prayer echoed in the farthest corner, or how the sound of a choir could embrace the congregation like a warm hug. I understood the physics of sound waves, of resonance, of reverberation. I was a man of science, of things that could be measured and predicted. I had spent my life amplifying the voices of the past, restoring the sound of lost spaces. And then I found a space whose sound should have been left to die. The story began on a dreary March afternoon, as the city of Portland, Oregon, was drowning in a cold, persistent rain. A man named Harrison Davenport came to my office. He was the embodiment of money and power, but his shoulders were weighed down by an undisguisable grief. He placed a professional-grade digital recorder on my desk and a check with numbers that made me pay attention. His son, Liam, and his group were missing. 4 young people, amateur documentary filmmakers, the kind people often call ghost hunters. They had gone to a place no one in their right mind would go, Echo Isle, and on it, a scar on the face of the island, St. Jude's Asylum. St. Jude's was a forgotten place, a decrepit asylum for those with sound-related afflictions. That was a euphemism. In reality, it was where they sent people who heard voices in their heads, people haunted by non-existent music, or people who could not bear the silence. It was shut down in the 50s after a series of mysterious deaths and inexplicable acts of violence. Since then, it had been abandoned, left to rot under the rains of the Pacific Northwest, becoming a local legend, a gruesome tale told around campfires. The police had searched. They found Liam's group's camp, but no trace of them, only this recorder. "This is my son's last recording," Davenport said. "The police say it's just static, worthless, but one of their team knows of you." He said if anyone could find something in this mess, it would be you, Mr. Finch. My job was to restore what was lost, to filter out the noise, to find the buried whispers. It was a professional challenge, and that check was an undeniable temptation. I accepted. It was the first mistake. That night, in the controlled silence of my studio, I connected the recorder, put on my headphones, and dove in. It was a wall of static, a thick white hiss. But I knew no chaos is perfect. There are always hidden patterns. I began to filter layer by layer. Hours passed, and then I heard it. It wasn't a voice. It was beneath the static. A rhythm, thump, thump, thump. A beat too slow, too mechanical, and between each beat there was a silence. A deep, empty silence that seemed to suck in all other sound. It made me nauseous. And then, after one of those silences, another sound. Liam's voice. He wasn't speaking. He was sobbing. A sob of absolute terror. And right after that, a scream. I've heard hundreds of screams, but this one was different. It wasn't directed outwards, it was directed inwards. Like the sound of someone being drained from the inside. The scream was choked off, turning into a horrific gurgle, and then static. Only the wall of static and that slow, monstrous beat remained. I ripped the headphones off, my heart hammering. Cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Something terrible had happened on that island. The next day I called Davenport. I told him what I'd found. I told him I couldn't do any more. But he begged. He doubled the money. Please, Mr. Finch, he said. Go there with your equipment, with your ears. Maybe you'll find something the police missed. Pride, curiosity, and greed, a deadly combination. I agreed. It was my final mistake as the Arthur Finch I used to be. Now, as I sit here in this artificial silence, I can still hear it, that beat. It's not on the tape anymore, it's in my head. Thump, thump, thump. A constant reminder of the price of listening. And this story, it's not an attempt to exorcise it. I know that's impossible. It's an attempt to understand why it chose me, and I fear that by telling you, I am only creating an echo. The trip to Echo Isle began from a small, dreary coastal town called Port Sorrow. The ferryman, an old-timer named Silas, had a face as wrinkled as an old map and eyes that had seen too much. He carried me on his old boat through a fog as thick as a wall of milk. Those kids, Silas spoke suddenly, his voice as hoarse as grinding stones. The filmmakers. I brought 'em out, eyes all bright. They didn't know what they were sailing into. He spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the sea. That place is sick, a sickness of sound. The fellas who built it, they thought they could cure the mad with silence, but they were wrong. They didn't create silence, they woke something up that lives in it. Something? I asked. Locals call it the silent echo, Silas said, his voice dropping. They say it ain't a ghost, it's an absence, a hole in the sound. When it's near, everything goes quiet. Not peaceful quiet, dead quiet. Birds stop singing, wind stops blowing, even the sound of the waves just stops. And if you stay in that silence too long, it starts to fill you. It eats the sounds inside you, your voice, your thoughts, your soul eventually. His words sounded like superstition, but the genuine fear in his eyes made it impossible to dismiss. The thing at St. Jude's doesn't talk, Silas added. It listens. When the island emerged from the fog, I understood why it was called Echo Isle. Jagged black cliffs rose from the sea, eroded by the waves into bizarre shapes like the giant speakers of a dead god. And at the highest point, like a rotting crown, sat St. Jude's Asylum. It was a monstrous, Gothic Victorian structure, its sharp spires clawing at the grey sky. Silas nudged the ferry against a rickety pier. "I'll be back at sunset," he said, not looking at me. "Don't be late." I hauled my cases of specialized equipment and stepped onto the island. Instantly, I felt it. The change in the air, a heaviness, a pressure against my eardrums. Silas was right. The place was unnaturally quiet. The group's campsite was a short distance from the shore. A few tents had been flattened by the wind. Everything had been left in a hurry. I began setting up my equipment, a series of highly sensitive microphones, a real-time spectrum analyzer, and a device of my own invention, something I called the sonic memory resonator. In theory, it could pick up residual sonic vibrations in an environment. As I worked, I found the first camera. It was half submerged in a mud puddle. The battery was completely dead. I connected it to a backup power source. The last clip was recorded at 2 a.m, 4 days prior. The screen flickered to life with a shaky, dark image. "Do you hear that?" Liam's voice whispered. "It stopped. Everything just stopped." The camera panned to the tent of a girl named Jessica. The tent flap slowly slid open. No one was pushing it. It opened on its own. And inside, it was empty. I felt a chill. They hadn't run off together. They were being taken one by one. I continued my search, moving cautiously towards the asylum. The closer I got, the thicker the silence became. It was no longer an absence of sound. It was a presence, an invisible wall pressing in on my body. My ears began to ache. The main door of St. Jude's had been torn from its hinges. The entrance was a massive hall with a soaring ceiling and a grand rotting wooden staircase. Dust lay as thick as grey snow, and in the middle of the hall I saw the first one. It was a young man. He was sitting leaning against the base of the staircase. His eyes were wide open, his mouth also wide open, as if in a silent scream. There wasn't a mark on him, but his face had a strange blue-gray pallor, and from his ears, eyes, and nose, rivulets of dried black blood had trickled, as if all the internal pressure in his body had been suddenly vacuumed out. I backed away, fighting the urge to vomit. I had to create a map of horror for this place, as Silas had said. I divided the building into 3 main areas based on old floor plans: the administrative wing at the front, the patient wings on either side, and the treatment wing at the back. The rumors said the most dangerous place was the treatment wing, specifically the anechoic chamber. In an office in the admin wing, I found the group's laptop. Its battery was also dead. I booted it up. On the screen was a journal file. Day 2, the last entry read. Sound doesn't obey the rules here. There are dead spots, areas in this building where all sound just seems to vanish. You walk into one and suddenly you can't hear your own footsteps. David calls them sonic voids. He thinks this is the key. He wants to set up a parabolic mic in one of the spots. A terrible idea. The sonic voids weren't dead spots. They were the monsters' mouths. I returned to the main hall where I'd placed the resonator. It had recorded something. I put on my headphones. At first only the sound of wind, but then I heard it. Faint, distant, heavy shuffling footsteps making no echo, and then a voice from the past, the voice of an old doctor. Experiment 73, patient E. They called him the musician. He claimed he could hear the music of the spheres. We placed him in the anechoic chamber for 72 hours. When we opened the door, he was gone. Only his clothes remained, and on the wall, he had used his own fingernails to scratch a single word before they were worn down to the bone. Listen, an echo from the past. But then another sound, a sound from the present, very close, a scratching sound. Skr, 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 coming from the floor above. I ripped off the headphones. The room fell silent again, but I knew I had heard it. Someone or something was still here. Fear told me to leave, but I couldn't. I pulled out a flare gun and I started towards the stairs, towards the scratching sound. The second-floor hallway was dark and stretched on endlessly. The doors to the patient rooms lined both sides like standing coffins. The air here was even heavier, carrying the smell of decay, of sickness and despair that had soaked into every plank of wood. The scratching had stopped. The silence returned, more terrifying this time. I switched on my headlamp. Its beam cut a narrow path through the gloom. I walked the length of the hall, glancing into each room. Inside were only rusted iron beds, tattered mattresses, and an infinite sadness. This was where broken souls had been imprisoned. I could almost feel their suffering, the echoes of their screams, their unanswered prayers, and then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a different door. It was made of thick steel with a small yellowed pane of reinforced glass. On the door was a tarnished brass plaque, Treatment Wing, Auditory Observation. I approached it. The steel door was ajar. This must have been where the scratching came from. Holding my breath, I pushed the door gently. It opened with a jarring shriek. Inside was an old laboratory. Long tables were covered in dust upon which sat strange equipment, huge reel-to-reel tape recorders, oscilloscopes with cracked screens, and thousands of magnetic tape reels stacked on rusted metal shelves. This was St. Jude's audio archive. In the center of the room, a wooden chair was bolted to the floor. Above it hung a metal helmet connected to dozens of tangled wires. My eyes scanned the room and then they stopped. On a table in the corner sat a thick, leather-bound journal. It was not covered in dust. Someone had been looking at it recently. I drew closer and opened it. It was the personal diary of Dr. Alistair Kane, the founder of St. Jude's. His handwriting was neat at the beginning, but towards the end it became a scrawled, frantic mess. He wasn't just trying to cure, he was obsessed. April 12, 1951. I read, another failure. Patient 42 ruptured his own eardrums with a paperclip. He said he would rather be deaf than listen to the gnawing static. This term again, the static. What is it? A mass auditory hallucination or something more tangible? June 3rd, 1951. I have had a breakthrough. I believe St. Jude's is not haunted. It is a focal point. A place where the veil between our world and the other is thin. And this thinness is not spatial, but frequential. There are sounds we cannot hear. I believe these patients, their brains have attuned themselves to hear them. They are not mad. They are pioneers. My heart beat faster. I flipped to the last pages. Kane's script was now almost illegible. It is real. I have recorded it, the silent echo. It is not an absence of sound. It is an anti-sound. A negative sound wave with the ability to cancel out other sound waves. A sort of sonic antimatter. I have named it Frequency Zero. When it interacts with biological tissue, it creates a horrific resonance. It doesn't just silence sound, it silences cells, it silences life. Below the text was a frantic drawing, a diagram of a device, something that looked like a massive antenna. Beneath the drawing was a single line. The gate, I must amplify it, I must open the gate. He wasn't trying to study it, he was trying to summon it. A small noise behind me made me jump. I spun around, flare gun raised. Standing in the doorway was a person, or at least it had been a person. It was a woman wearing the tattered clothes of one of the film crew members, Jessica. But her face... Dear God, it was chalk white, stretched and featureless like a porcelain doll. Her eyes were two empty black pits. Her mouth was just a thin, sealed line. She wasn't breathing, and she was scratching. Her hands, her fingernails broken and bloody, were clawing at the steel door frame. Skr, skr, skr. A futile attempt to make a sound. She didn't look at me. Her empty gaze looked through me. She was just a shell. I backed away slowly, but I bumped against the leg of the table. The diary fell to the floor with a loud, echoing thud. The shell's head snapped towards me. A jerky movement. It had heard me, and from its sealed mouth a sound began to emerge. Not a voice, a hiss, the static, the horribly familiar sound from Liam's recording. It grew louder, filling the room, filling my head. I covered my ears and screamed, but I couldn't hear my own scream. The static had swallowed it. The entity, Jessica, began to advance on me. I scrambled out of the room, never taking my eyes off it. I burst into the hallway and ran. I ran for my life, not caring which direction. I just knew I had to get away from that sound. I found a staircase leading down to the basement. Without thinking, I plunged down it, slamming the heavy wooden door behind me and bolting it shut. Below was darkness and the smell of damp. I slumped to the floor, panting. I understood now. Dr. Kane had opened something he couldn't control, a parasitic sonic entity. It had turned the patients and now Liam's group into shells, mobile amplifiers for its presence. I had to destroy it. But how do you kill a sound? I remembered. Antimatter. Kane had written that the silent echo was a negative sound wave. If so, a positive sound wave, an extremely loud, pure sound, could neutralize it. But where could I find a sound like that? And then I saw it. At the end of the tunnel. Another door reinforced with steel, but this one had a symbol carved on it. A bell. The chapel. David, one of the group, had heard piano music from the chapel. Maybe there was something there. A pipe organ or a large bell. A powerful source of sound. It was my only hope. I stood up. The fear was still there, but now it had a companion. A cold determination. I was no longer an observer. I was a survivor. I made my way through the labyrinth of basement tunnels. The air here was thick with the old smell of coal and neglect. Finally, I reached the door with the carved bell. I pushed it gently and stepped inside. A strange sensation washed over me. The air here, it was cleaner. The oppressive, suffocating feeling seemed to lift. I was standing at the back of a small chapel. Dust-covered pews of dark oak sat in neat rows facing a pulpit. Above the pulpit was a huge stained glass window, which, though dirty and cracked, still allowed a stream of ethereal grey light to filter in. This place felt safe, like an oasis of sanity in an ocean of madness. My eyes scanned the chapel, searching for a source of sound, and then I saw it. Not a bell, but a pipe organ tucked into an alcove. Its metal pipes reached almost to the ceiling. He was trying to create specific frequencies. A plan began to form in my mind. A crazy, dangerous plan, but the only one I had. I didn't need the organ. I could create the frequency. I had to go back to the treatment wing, but I couldn't go through the main hallway. The entity, Jessica, was probably still there. I looked around the chapel, searching for another way, and I found it. A small door, almost hidden by the organ. A choir door. I opened it. It led to a narrow, dusty corridor. A shortcut, perhaps. I stepped into the corridor, closing the chapel door behind me. The safety vanished. The oppressive silence returned, but this time I had a purpose. The narrow corridor led me around the back of the asylum. I moved quickly, but cautiously. I could feel its presence all around me, an invisible cold, a watchful stillness. I reached the steel door of the auditory observation room once more. This time I didn't hesitate. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The Jessica entity was gone. The room was empty, but the air still held the reek of ozone and static. I hurried to the corner where the giant tuning forks were kept. They were nearly as tall as I was, made of stainless steel. Each one had a specific frequency etched into it. I took out the handwritten sheet music. I'm not a musician, but I understand frequency. I could translate these notes. This melody wasn't a melody. It was a formula, a sequence of frequencies that had to be played in a precise order and timing. I found the corresponding tuning forks. Luckily, they were all here. I needed 5 of them. I dragged them to the center of the room. Now for the hard part. How to activate them all at once and in the right rhythm. I needed something to strike them with. I looked around and found a metal rod, probably part of a broken stand. Perfect. But I knew the moment I made the first sound, it would come. It would be drawn to the vibrations like a shark to blood. I had to work fast. I took a deep breath. I looked at the music one last time, memorizing the sequence of notes. And then I began. I struck the first tuning fork with the metal rod. Boom! A low, sustained, pure tone filled the room. It was a beautiful, clean sound, a stark contrast to the rotten silence of St. Jude's, and instantly I felt it, a shift in the air pressure, a sudden cold, and the static hiss began to return, faint at first, then rapidly growing stronger. It was coming. I didn't dare look. I focused on my task. I struck the second tuning fork. Buying. A higher note joined the first, creating a simple harmony. The static grew louder, more aggressive. I could hear shuffling in the hallway outside. I struck the third, then the fourth. Each new note was an act of defiance. The pure sound of the forks battled the chaotic hiss. I glanced at the door. A black shape was forming in the threshold. It had no clear form. It was a distortion in the air. A man-shaped hole in reality, the silent echo. It was there. It had no eyes, but I felt it watching me. I had only one note left, the highest, most critical note in the sequence. The hiss was now unbearable. It was drilling into my skull. The room began to shake. Tapes fell from the shelves. The few remaining light bulbs on the ceiling flickered and burst. The black shape began to ooze into the room, swallowing the light as it moved. It reached out an arm made of static towards me. I could feel the energy being pulled from my body, a deathly cold spreading up from my feet. This was my last chance. I let out a defiant yell, and with all my remaining strength, I struck the final tuning fork. Keng! The sound, a high, crystal-clear note, tore through the air, and then something miraculous happened. As the 5 frequencies combined, they created a resonant cascade. An invisible sonic shockwave pulsed out from the tuning forks. It wasn't a sound you could hear with your ears. It was something you felt with your entire body, a vibration at a molecular level. The static entity convulsed. Its hiss turned into a scream of agony, a tortured distortion of sound and silence. It recoiled, its form beginning to disintegrate like a badly tuned television signal. I knew I had to maintain it. I kept striking the forks in their sequence, creating a loop of destructive harmony. The black shape was driven back to the center of the room. It contracted, swirling like a tornado of darkness and white noise. The light in the room bent around it. I felt like I was looking into a miniature black hole, and then with a silent pop, an implosion of sound, it was gone. The static hiss cut out. Silence fell. But this time, it was a normal silence, an empty but peaceful silence. The oppression was gone. I stood there, panting, drenched in sweat. The metal rod fell from my hand. I had done it. I had won. But at what cost? As the adrenaline began to fade, I realized my ears, they were bleeding. A thin trickle of blood ran down both sides of my neck, and I couldn't hear my own breathing anymore. The resonance hadn't just destroyed the entity, it had destroyed a part of me. I stumbled out of the treatment wing. I found the bodies of the other 2 members of Liam's group. They had died just like the first. There was nothing I could do for them. As I walked out of the asylum, the sun was setting, painting the sky and the sea in blood-red hues. Silas and his fairy were there. I had survived. But as I walked the path, I realized a part of St. Jude's would be with me forever. The silence in my ears wasn't peace. It was an absence, a void, an echo. That is my story. The story of how I lost the thing I treasured most, but that is not the end. Because as I said, some stories are viruses. After I returned, I tried to live a normal life. I received Davenport's check, but money couldn't fill the emptiness inside me. I was partially deaf, and my tinnitus was a constant high-pitched hiss, a permanent reminder. I built this room, my fortress of silence, to escape the world, but I cannot escape what is inside. About a month ago, something changed. The hiss in my ears began to form patterns. It was no longer a chaotic white noise. Sometimes, for a brief moment, it would arrange itself into a rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't completely destroyed. A fragment of it, a final echo, had latched onto me. It had hidden in the silence it created within me. And it is slowly growing back. That is why I'm telling this story. It is an act of desperation. I reread Kane's diary. He wrote, "It feeds on silence, but it spreads through sound. It is an information parasite. It needs a host to exist, but it needs a medium to travel. By telling you this story, by converting my memory into sound waves, I fear I've given it that medium. It is no longer trapped in me. It's now out there, in these words, in the vibrations reaching your eardrums. Do not be afraid. That is what it wants." Fear creates a silence in the mind, a void for it to take root. I don't know what to do. It grows stronger. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see my reflection distort for a moment. Sometimes I wake up to find I have been scratching at the soundproofed walls. Now, I have only one final option, one final sacrifice. I have learned from Kane's mistake, and from the wisdom of the musician. I cannot fight it with sound. I must fight it with silence. Not a manufactured silence, but an absolute one. I will stop speaking. I will stop thinking in words. I will empty my mind, turn it into a desert, and give it nothing to feed on. I will become a shell, but a shell of my own choosing. These are my last words, a warning, a confession, and a farewell. If one day you hear an inexplicable static hiss in a quiet room, or if you feel an unnatural silence press down on the air, remember me. Make a sound, sing a song, scream. Don't let the silence take hold. As for me, I am walking into the stillness, hoping that by doing so I can take this monster with me. And now the silence begins to